Hi guys, and welcome to the first in a series of 5 videos about personal productivity. This is a series of 5 videos in which I'm going to talk about what I see as the 5 really key and most important components of personal effectiveness and personal productivity. And those 5 components are firstly prioritization, secondly interdependence or working with others, thirdly task efficiency, fourthly, resilience, and finally, continuous improvement, continually getting better at work tasks and being productive and effective. Okay, so the first one I'm going to get into in this video is prioritization. By prioritization, what I mean is the act of, discerning and selecting projects, tasks, and activities, and most importantly, deciding which things to say yes to and which to say no to. Okay, so realize that prioritization is critical, absolutely critical for personal effectiveness and being able to practically execute and be effective in life and in your professional life and in your personal life as well. And too many people think busyness and efficiency are the goal. In fact, busyness does not equal productivity. Being aimlessly busy does not lead to success. And in fact, busy work often, constrains or even kills your success. But I don't want you to take my word for it. So the way I'm going to explore this in this series of videos, and today is through what I want to call a book synergy. So what I'm going to do is I've got 4 books here, and these books are selected from what I see as being the top books on personal effectiveness and productivity, and they all have something really profound and interesting to say around prioritization specifically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through each of these books, and we're going to take the key lessons, see what we can learn from each of them, and then I'm going to talk through what are the kind of common principles that we can kind of glean from the group of thinkers that we've got in these texts, and then how we can synthesize some practical techniques and powerful techniques and strategies to prioritize even more effectively and be even more productive. So the 4 books I want to speak with you today are first of all, Essentialism by McKeown. Second of all, classic 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Covey. Thirdly, the 4-Hour Work Week, and finally, The One Thing. Okay, so to dive in first of all with Essentialism. So this is a book really about mindset and having the correct mindset to focus on what is essential and to reject what is non-essential. And in this book, McKeown basically talks about how there is a essentialist philosophy, someone who adheres to that concept of doing what is essential, and there's a non-essentialist philosophy, which is pretty much what the average man adheres to. The average person who is not effective will be thinking what will be the narrative in their head. And he says, the key mindsets of the non-essentialist, that average person, are with regards to prioritization and productivity, are I have to, it's all important, and I can do both. Okay, and what he says is those are not useful mindsets. Okay, so the narrative going through their head is I have to, it's all important, and I can do both. And what he says is we need to take those questions and replace them with the essentialist mindset and the essentialist philosophy. And what that is instead of I have to, I choose to. Instead of it's all important, only a few things matter. And instead of I can do both, we should say I can do anything but not everything. Okay, so on a practical level, the book really advocates a kind of two key steps for prioritization, and they are discerning the trivial many from the vital few, and then once that's done, cutting out the trivial many. Okay, so what he says is that the essentialist can really discern the trivial many from the vital few, and he realizes that this vital few are the really essential things, and he'll focus on that. Okay, so being able to discern is really critical, and he says, you know, we should adopt a mindset of less but better, not more, do as much as I can, but do less and do it better, because the reason we should do this is because we live in a world where almost everything is worthless and only a few things are exceptionally valuable. So everything, you know, really is a trade-off. And instead of saying, I'll do both, we should be saying, what can I go big on? What can I really focus on? What can I put all my effort into, and that will give me the greatest benefit? Okay. So on a real kind of, that's the kind of key philosophy of the essentialist, and what essentialism really espouses around prioritization. On a day-to-day practical level, the kind of techniques that it advocates are to create free space of a couple of hours, it says, a day, where you can really sit down and focus on and kind of think through what are the essential things that I should be doing, and organize and reprioritize on that kind of continual basis. So that it says should be 4 half-an-hour slots every day, adding up to a total of 2 hours, where you sit down and do that prioritization. The other practical technique is having specific and strict decision criteria around making prioritization decisions. So what he says is that you should, every time you have to make a decision or assess a series of options, you should set one specific decision criteria of the essential attribute that option has to have for you to pick it. And if it doesn't score either a 9 or a 10 out of 10, you should automatically discard it. And while this can lead to a kind of continual quest for perfection, in some cases, actually, it's a much simpler way to live, and it's better to say hell yeah to something than to say oh yeah to a load of things and not do them properly. So he says the answer should always either be hell yeah or it's no. Okay, so that's kind of the key stuff from essentialism, and actually I think that's set up some concepts that we'll probably see repeated throughout some of the other books. So the second one I want to talk to you about is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this is a really, really classic book, and I'd be really surprised if you haven't read it. If you haven't, definitely check it out. It's got 7 habits in it, but actually today we're going to talk about just 2, and the 2 key ones for prioritization are habit number 2, which is begin with the end in mind, and habit number 3, which is put first things first. Okay, so for Covey, beginning with the end in mind is about realizing that all things are really created twice. So before things actually manifest themselves in the physical world, they're always created once mentally as an idea or a thought in someone's head. And they are conceived that way before they manifest themselves in the physical world. So before we can prioritize effectively, Covey says we must begin with the end in mind by understanding and knowing what is deeply important to us, and then by making our decisions in alignment with those overarching values. And his third habit of putting first things first is really the practical fulfillment of that second habit, beginning with the end in mind. And what he says is, once we know that the ladder is placed against the correct wall, it's really about selecting the right rungs and sequence of actions to scale the ladder most effectively. So he says we should be like the carpenter who thinks twice but cuts once. Okay, so by thinking carefully and then putting things into action, we can ensure that we're really being most effective in our physical activities. Okay, so the way he really practically suggests going about doing this is through the use of a time management framework, and his time management matrix is quite famous. You might have come across it before, but basically it categorizes everything, all things, all tasks, all activities, and all projects into basically on two different dimensions, and those dimensions are the urgency of the task and the importance of the task. So everything is relatively more or less urgent and relatively more or less important. And what he says is that by thinking about things this way, you can really make decisions about what is the most what is the most effective time management strategy for you. And what he essentially says is that quadrant 1 activities, those which are most important and most urgent, do deserve your time. But the trick is not to spend all your time in that quadrant, because if you're spending time on those activities which are deadline-driven projects or crises, you are constantly firefighting, you're constantly trying to deal with urgent issues and overcome urgent problems, and that can lead to stress and burnout, and it's not an effective way to manage yourself and manage your time. Okay. Equally, if you're spending time in quadrants 3 and 4, which are less important and more urgent, and less important and less urgent tasks, you are essentially wasting time because you're working on things that are not important. So those things might be, I essentially term them distractions. So things like phone calls that aren't really important, and you can just ignore. Things like he also categorizes pleasant activities as not urgent and not important. Now, not suggesting you can cut that out completely, but look, if you're overindulging in that, you can extract some of the time and harvest some of that time there. And what he really says is that the objective is to take the time from quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, those less urgent, less important and more urgent, less important activities, and invest that into quadrant 2. Now, quadrant 2 is activities and tasks that are less urgent but more important. Okay, so what might that be? He says those kind of things are long-range planning, building relationships, exercising, things that are not necessarily pressing and urgent things to do right now, but that will pay off in future, and probably have an exponential effect on your success and your effectiveness. So it's really important that those are the things that you invest more time in to become more effective, because what he says is that by spending more time in that quadrant 2, the impact of that will be to shrink quadrant 1, meaning that you have less stress, less urgent crises, and less disasters. And the way you do that is, like I've said, harvest time out of 3 and 4, put it into number 2. And related to that, he has a really powerful distinguishing question for prioritization, to identify those things that are quadrant 2 activities that deserve that investment of time. And that the question that he poses to himself, and he suggests that we use to identify those priority activities, are: what one thing could you do in your personal and professional life that, if you did on a regular basis, would make a tremendous positive difference in your life? Okay, so that's a really powerful practical question that we can use to identify that top priority and make sure we're working in quadrant 2. Okay, the next book I want to speak through is Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Work Week. Now, this is not a pure exploration of professional productivity and how to be effective, but its real purpose was driving towards minimizing the time you spend working, and it's actually one of the best kind of most impassioned diatribes I've ever seen on personal ineffectiveness and busy work entrapment, and Tim Ferriss is really goes out of his way in this book to say that, you know, the real laziness is not actually not doing work or doing little work, but the real laziness is being cognitively lazy about prioritization and selecting the right work to do. Too many people are just busy, and they are lazy in selecting and taking those hard decisions about what they will and what they won't do, what they'll say yes and what they'll say no to. Okay, so Ferris's kind of top techniques, or his top tip for prioritization, is to really focus on elimination. What can I eliminate? In a similar way to the Essentialist, he and Covey's third and fourth quadrant, he talks about getting rid of those non-essential activities. But the way he suggests doing that is using what an Italian economist is using a law based on the works of a famous Italian economist called Pareto. And this is Pareto's law, which states that the top 80% of outputs come from the top 20% of the inputs. So 20% of the effort gives you 80% of the reward or payoff. And you know, Ferris's advice is that you should always be performing a Pareto analysis to identify what is the 20% of things that I'm doing that are giving me 80% of the payoff or reward, and just to cut all the other 80% of things that you're doing and focus in on doing more of that 20%, and you'll exponentially increase your output. Equally, he says, focus on what 20% of things are causing me 80% of the problems, and cut out that 20%. Make sure that those are the first things that you get rid of, and get them out of your business, out of your life, out of your tasks, your day-to-day, wherever they're manifesting themselves. Get rid of the top 20% of problems. And he says that he actually fired a number of his customers and saw like nearly all of his complaints disappear because he was applying that rule on a negative level as well as a positive one. So the second thing I should mention on this one is that Tim Ferriss actually suggests using a concept called Parkinson's law to help put leverage on yourself to prioritize things. Okay, and Parkinson's law is the concept or idea that tasks will expand, or work will expand, to fill the amount of time allotted to it. Okay, so if you give yourself a week to do an essay or to complete a work project, that's how long it'll take you, because you will naturally plan to spend that long. You'll research longer, or you'll procrastinate until the last minute, and you'll get it done just for that deadline. Whereas if you set an artificially short timeline, you'll actually deliver to that timeline, and you'll get because you'll be forced to do either condense the work or choose the top priority things, the things that the kind of critical success factors that have to be done are the top priorities for that work. So by using Parkinson's law, Ferris says that's a really great form of leverage to force yourself to prioritize and actually put that pressure on yourself to make yourself not lazy, to take away the comfort of having lots of time and actually being lazy in your thinking and just performing busy work, but actually put that leverage on yourself to focus in and do the critical top priorities. All right, so those are kind of the key prioritization tips from the 4-Hour Workweek. The next book that I want to talk to you about is going to be The One Thing. And I actually love this book. It's got some really great tips in it about all areas of productivity, and it's really thin, but it's an absolute Bible. It's full of value, so I definitely suggest reading it. But the kind of key things in this, and this book really has one of the most powerful focusing questions. I mean, I know we've heard Covey's question already, but I think the focusing question for prioritization in the one thing is even better, and that question is, what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will become easier or unnecessary? Okay, so what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? And this question is really directly related to the core theme of the book and the core motif of the book, really, which is about the lead domino, which is, based on the concept that the lead domino in a stack of dominoes can actually knock over a domino that is 50% larger than it. So if you focus on, as he says, whacking away at that lead domino until it falls, it can bring down the next one and the next one and the next one, all of which are bigger, and they give you a really, really exponential effect. So like the other authors, this one really focuses on taking that one top priority, the most essential thing, and really focusing in on it. So the author in this book, Gary Keller, I think it is, Gary Keller cites the Pareto rule as well as Tim Ferris, but what he says is we should take it even further into what he calls extreme Pareto. And extreme Pareto is basically taking, instead of the top 20%, it's taking the 20% of the 20% of the 20% and so on until you get down to the one key, the one most important thing. Okay, in the overall paradigm for effectiveness in the one thing is that productivity is driven by priority, which is guided by purpose. Okay, so Gary Keller says we should live with purpose, live by priority, and live for productivity. And zooming in on that kind of living by priority element, he says it's really about behaving appropriately in the moments of our lives that matter. Okay, and the theory behind that is that success is built on a series of present moments. It's not about what I will do or what I was doing. It's about what will I do in this moment right here, getting that right, and then getting the next moment right and the next moment right. And success is really sequential, not simultaneous. It's about getting the right domino, knocking that over, getting the next domino in the right place, getting that knocked over, and so on and so on. It's a series of correct behaviors within those moments of our lives that matter. Okay, on a kind of practical level, like some of the other guys, Keller focuses on blocking out time for prioritization. What he specifically says is that in terms of actually prioritizing, we should have 1 hour a week where we review our yearly and monthly goals, but specifically to make sure, in a similar way to Ferris with Parkinson's law, but to make sure we have a set amount of time, both carved out and defended, to do that most one productive thing. We should carve out 4 hours a day to just focus on that one top priority, because if that's the one most important thing, it's the one thing we should be doing. It's the one most, if it's the most important thing, it's the most important thing to be doing. So we have 4 set hours to focus the majority of the day just to focus on that. Okay. The other kind of practical tip he has is instead of having a to-do list where you just write down things in order and then do them in that order, don't just do things in the order that you write them. Okay, it's pretty it's pretty basic actually, but a lot of people don't do this. So just when you've got a to-do list, actually take the time to stop, go through it, and reorder it and reorganize it in order, starting with the one most important thing and then the next most important thing, and so on, and do it in that order. Okay, I mean, finally, the last kind of third key practical kind of technique or tip that I took from this is really that, it's about saying yes and saying no. And saying yes to your one thing should be your top priority all the time. And he says that, you know, sometimes a yes has to be defended with 1,000 no's. So he says only requests that connected to your one thing should be considered. And you should say no respectively, but constructively to all other requests. Okay, so by respectively and constructively, that might be you know, polite and suggesting an alternative course of action or someone else that can help the person with that task or request. But critically, stay focused on your one thing, defend your one thing, defend the time for your one thing, and defend your focus on that thing as well. Okay, so looking at these 4 books, there's really 4 key principles that stand out for me in terms of prioritization and how it makes you more personally productive. And I think the first one is really that prioritization is really important. It's actually critical for effectiveness and high performance because, you know, not everything matters equally, and it's critical to be able to discern the most important things because you can't do everything. You know, paying attention to everything means shortchanging everything, and actually you need to really focus in on those core things that are your top priorities. And to do that, you need to be able to prioritize effectively. Okay. The second, I guess, key principle that's come out of this is that effective prioritization really requires an overarching kind of guiding vision for or an overarching goal. You know, so prioritization can only really be directed properly based on a higher purpose. And we heard, you know, Covey talk about this, a couple of the other books as well, talking about how prioritization is driven by purpose. Prioritization is based on starting with the end in mind and keeping the bigger picture in mind. And having clarity of that is really critical to drive your prioritization efforts. You know, that's the kind of guiding values by which you can make those prioritization decisions. And without that, prioritization really is a bit useless because prioritization is designed to drive you towards those goals, get you doing the right thing to go towards those goals, and you really have to know exactly what you're shooting for. Okay, the third key principle I think that we've discussed is that prioritization should always be driven by what will give you the higher payoff for the kind of lower investment. So a lot of the books are talking about the Pareto rule and discerning that which is of greater value, of more importance, you know, eliminating that which is trivial in search of the vital few. And what really characterizes those vital few is that they are the key things that for a lower amount of effort will give you a higher payoff. Yeah, so it may be that they require a lot of input and a lot of effort, but that's the only thing you need to do and it'll get you to your goal. Or they might be that it's a quick thing to do, but it will have a really great impact and get you a long way towards your goal, whereas something else with the same effort won't get you as far. So that's what you prioritize. And all these thinkers are working on that basis. And it's basically a kind of it's a risk. It's not a risk, sorry. It's an investment and a payoff way of thinking. Very similar to a lot of financial investments, but you're actually normally thinking about your time or your effort or your resources and focusing on that key thing. You know, Gary Keller says it's one thing. Tim Ferris says the top 20%. The other guys say it's the essential things. Covey says it's the important things, but there's always a set of things that are going to give you the greatest impact, and you've got to focus in and identify those. Okay. The fourth principle is really to be cognizant of the exponential effect when choosing priorities. Okay, because there are things that will have seemingly greater impact, but it may only be short term. There are things that will have seemingly lesser impact, but it'll be exponential and knock-on effect. It's the lead domino and it's going to affect other things down the line. So it's important to be really cognizant that when you're looking for the top 20% or those really big payoff items, that some of them are going to be really exponential. They're going to be the ones that are the lead domino. They're going to knock down subsequent dominoes that are going to make subsequent things easier or unnecessary. And those are the ones that are typically going to be a higher payoff, although it might take a bit more thinking to identify them. Okay. So those are, I think, are the really key learnings, and I think they're really powerful principles to apply in prioritization. The final thing I just want to point out is that there's some really powerful techniques in these books as well, and the kind of top four that I pull out would be first of all the focusing question. So we saw this in the one thing, which is a really powerful focusing question, and then we saw this in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People as well. And those questions are, what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will become easier or unnecessary? Or what one thing could you do in your personal and professional life that if you did on a regular basis would make a tremendous positive difference? Okay, so I think the focusing question is a really great tool, a really great technique to use to identify that top priority. The second one I think is just purely taken from Stephen Covey, and I use this all the time, and it's the time management matrix. If you don't have, if you haven't seen the time management matrix, just type it in on Google and have a look at it. You can always think in your mind, or even just draw it out, where you're spending time in those 4 quadrants. And if you're finding yourself stressed out, you're probably in quadrant 1. If things aren't going right for you, you probably need to spend more time in quadrant 2. And frankly, it's nice to spend time sometimes in quadrant 3 and 4, but take a look at yourself if you're spending a lot of time in there. It's a really, really useful way of thinking about things. So really, really check that one out. Time management matrix is the second key technique. The third one is the decision criteria. And this is something that I think was talked about in Essentialism, but it's just about having a really strict decision criteria for selecting an option and making those decisions not emotionally but rationally and logically. So next time you have a decision to make and you're prioritizing things, don't let yourself cave into what you think is the right answer. Potentially you're basing that on emotion, or you're basing it on a cognitive heuristic. Instead, and by cognitive heuristic I mean a kind of a cognitive psychological fallacy, something that your brain is tricking you to think that you shouldn't really think. It's not logical and rational. Okay, so try and apply those strict decision criteria, and if the thing does not score 9 or 10 out of 10, discard it and pick a different option, or wait for a different option, or find a different option. I think that's a really great technique, and one that I'm definitely going to start using even more. The final thing really is about the kind of tips around time boxing, and in 2 ways really. I think time boxing, and then also Parkinson's law, which we saw in the 4-hour work week. So in terms of time boxing, it's clearly really recommended that you allocate specific time to allow focus on priority tasks, and to also confine working time to force us to prioritize. So that's kind of Parkinson's law coming into play. So clearly you need to have that time set aside where you're going to focus on the stuff that you prioritize. That makes your prioritization actually impactful, but then you also need to limit that time, because that's going to make your prioritization effective, i.e. you have a set amount of time and you really need to focus on the top priority things and the key things only within that window. And having that finite window is going to force you to prioritize. It puts leverage on you to take the time and mental effort to do that prioritization. Okay, so that was a quick rundown on prioritization, which is the first component of personal productivity. And I hope you enjoyed that. That was the book synergy of The One Thing, 4-hour work week, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and Essentialism, and I highly recommend reading all of them. Check out my next video for interdependence, which I'm going to be talking about team working and the kind of top key principles and concepts around interdependence, and how you can work with other people to be highly productive and highly effective. Okay, cheers, until next time.